Hello, my name is Tolga. I exist, therefore I think too much. I should have recorded yesterday and posted today, but I'm recording and posting on the same day because stress. They say bad things happen in threes. The third pin dropped, so spent a day just kind of emotionally dealing with that. And therein, today I'm wearing glasses. My eyesight gets blurry when I'm stressed. Don't know what the fuck that's about. So I figured I am going to make amends, not necessarily by actually doing what I normally do and reading from the two books that I plan to read from eventually, but instead reading from my favorite again. Favorite book. This one isn't necessarily favorite chapter, it's just another good one. Another reason I like the book. I plan on just reading it, so no warning about cussing here. Although I guess, the topic's not necessarily PG. But yeah, this is a thing. As you read these pages, you can plainly see how foolishly prodigal I have been with the raw material of my life. I think it must be plain to everyone what a bad householder I really am, and with what reckless improvidence I scatter the wealth of my experience without the slightest regard for the rules of thrift and profitable investment. Here, in these comparatively scant pages, I serve up the peculiar and fascinating lives of some 35 or 40-odd people. And yet it must be obvious that, with just a little common foresight, all these exciting documentary riches could easily have served to make at least 20 or 25 books of 600 or 700 pages each. These tomes might have been sold to some enterprising Hollywood producers, even before publication, perhaps, and this, in its turn, could have netted me the basic increment for a substantial estate. Also, the eventual movies ensuing from these enterprises would have borne so little actual resemblance to my books that, through these amiable celluloid distortions alone, I could have received the love of untold millions who don't even suspect that I am alive. But I suppose that's how it is with people who live recklessly. They won't ever learn. At any rate, there is always the consoling possibility that I may not perish of any of my multifarious ailments after all. I may just wind up laughing myself to death over all the wonderful chances in my life that I have managed to miss. Which brings me back to my funeral, and to another person who probably won't be able to attend, because chances are she will be in jail again. I'm talking here about a most remarkable girl called Roberta Stanton, of whom I first became aware in the Public Health Service Hospital in Lexington, Kentucky. We were both patients at this place. That is to say, we were both there to be cured of our chronic drug addictions, and since it was the rule of the institution that men and women could not communicate with each other, it was quite impossible for me to talk to her during the entire long period of our sequestration. Nevertheless, human ingenuity being devious as well as relentless, we did manage to correspond with one another pretty consistently. Despite the stringent interdictions of the local authorities, Roberta was in an unusually fortunate position to facilitate this traffic between us because, as her special work assignment, she happened to be in charge of a couple of small children for one of the officers at the hospital. I, on the other hand, as chief contributor and staff artist for the institutional newspaper, was privileged to roam pretty freely all over the place, and so it was not too difficult for me to amble quite casually within pretty close operational radius of Roberta and her infant charges. These children, girls by the way, were generally disporting themselves on the various well-kept lawns of the hospital, and Roberta would simply insert her letter to me in the rubber panties of one of these little ones, when the freight-bearing youngster, full of high spirits, would run exuberantly across the grass in my direction, I would find occasion to lift her playfully high into the air and incidentally to disencumber her of any of her contraband messages. My replies would go back to Roberta by the very same means, and it goes without saying that I acquired something of a local reputation as an extravagantly devoted lover of all childhood. By the way, nothing ever went wrong with this novel form of mail delivery. I would only like to suggest that nobody at Lexington, either now or in the near future, ought to risk trying it again. The reason I had written Roberta in the first place was that she enjoyed an astonishing reputation for wit, kindness, and the good spirits among all the hospital personnel that had ever had any contact with her. The doctors were particularly loud in their praises of her. "She is the best influence among the female patients in the whole place," Dr. Pregman once told me. "How come?" I said. "What does she do?" "She encourages and finally persuades even the most cooperative parents to take psychotherapy. She invents little ingenious competitions among them. She keeps up their spirits. She is full of good sense. And all I can tell you is that every time she is discharged from here, this place becomes an absolute shambles. We are simply desolate without her." "How often has she been in here?" I asked. "About 12 times, I think," said Dr. Pregman. "Does she take therapy?" "Yes, every time she comes back." "Funny, isn't it," I said, "that such a great influence for good on the other patients in this dreary place should be quite unable to manage any kind of a life for herself on the outside?" "It is fascinating," said Dr. Pregman. "I wish I could devote a few years to deciphering this particular enigma. What is even more amazing is that she is quite well read and not unaware of this strange dichotomy in her character." "I think she is very good looking, too," I said. "What does she do on the outside? What can a woman drug addict without means possibly do on the outside? She is a prostitute? Naturally. What else?" I talked about her to one of the chief guards around the place, too. He told me that in the past year she had encouraged the girls in her sector to lay out garden plots in the spring, and that the morale level among these women had risen to new, unprecedented heights. "She is a real little mother to those tramps," he said, "and yet, according to her record, she's quite a tramp herself." "Maybe she's all right as long as she's away from men," I said. "Must be," he said. "She always gets into trouble the minute she hits the street." So naturally, I wrote to her. In an institution of that sort, the grapevine carries everything worth knowing, and it stands to reason that Roberta was pretty well aware of my predicament too. I was a multiple recidivist at that hospital, like herself, and I, too, in various ways, was something of an influence for the good among the men in my division. I gave French lessons, I held classes in English literature, I wrote articles and drew cartoons for our paper, and I certainly spent a good deal of my time in purely altruistic pursuits. Roberta answered my letter eagerly and at once, because she knew I had managed to make a pretty good living on the outside, and so she felt quite reassured that I wasn't just looking for an easy way to become her pimp, after both of us would be discharged from the institution. This, indeed, is the chief and very good reason why the hospital authorities forbid any sort of contact between the sexes down there. Too many of my fellow collegians had always been procurers and panderers on the street. And they were certainly not above recruiting a suitable stable for themselves during their months of intramural confinement. At any rate, Roberta answered my letter very pleasantly and very intelligently, and she particularly asked me for a reading list of books which she might obtain at the institutional library. I wrote to her pretty consistently after that, and I must say, very proudly, that neither one of us ever befouled those letters of ours with sentimental drivel or facile endearments of any sort. I'm certain that we became very fond of one another in the course of time, and I can assure you that the arrival of the harmless notes from that dear girl gave sudden point and meaning to my otherwise desperately shadowed existence. I suppose the human heart is truly lost if it cannot hang onto some fragment of a dream, or a sliver of meaningful purpose, somewhere. During this, my third visit to Lexington, I had so completely lost contact with the real world that I wrote almost no letters to anyone at all. When mail distribution time came, at around 4 o'clock every afternoon, and even the raucous voices in that coarse place were suddenly muted by the loving human influences which filtered through to us from the outside, I never bothered to ask whether anything had arrived for me, since I had long before voluntarily withdrawn from all contact with the few people who were still vaguely concerned with me. It was Roberta alone who nourished my frustrated spirits and my atrophied heart during those sterile months, and, as she later confessed to me, it was the contents of my letters which gave her the strength to face her own oncoming discharge date with a certain amount of hopeful resolution. Let's get this thing straight. She never, even for one single moment, expected to build any part of her future around me. Nothing could have been further from her mind. Quite the contrary. At no time did she indicate that she ever expected to see me on the outside, and I was so well aware of her feelings that I never made the vacuous suggestion that we might. And if you wonder about all this, it is only because you haven't the vaguest idea how the other half feels. The so-called criminal classes, or even the tarnished fringes of society which are adjacent to them, lead lives that are as completely circumscribed by behavioristic codes and shibboleths as the most exclusive aristocracy. Roberta, within the focus of her modest self-appraisal, knew perfectly well that my correspondence with her represented no sort of commitment on any part at all. She knew that I was neither a pimp nor a professional thief, and my graduation into the ranks of drug addiction was bound to remain an eternal enigma to her. She was fully aware, of course, that sometimes even rich or intelligent people became ensnared in such a life, but the folk Moors of her class had indoctrinated her to believe that such sordid immersions into the mire were due to some decadent streak in their natures, some quite untypical psychic blemish, which still in no way made them fellow members with the real old settlers, who had arrived at their degradation legitimately, through a lifelong proximity to the moral sewers of the world. To Roberta, I was a learned man who had one day decided to go slumming and who had somehow, through some incalculable lesion in his will, become entrapped by a vice that possessed some peculiar compensations for his momentary needs. I don't mean to say that she was able to reason this all out in such minute and painstaking fashion. She just felt that even if I had returned to Lexington 3 times, that outside, in the world, somewhere, certain people would be accessible to me whose own lives had always been untainted by even the slightest tinge of dishonor. I dare say in some ways I must have puzzled her quite as much as she puzzled me. After all, I too seemed to get along wonderfully well inside the institution. I managed excellently without drugs of any kind, as long as there were solid walls and barred doors and windows around me. But the minute I hit the street, I instantly fell back into the arms of morphine again, because, for some undefinable reason, I had somehow lost the almost instinctive method of procedure by which men over the millennia have learned to parcel out their freedoms. It was her case exactly. But to her, the similarity was only superficial. She had been born and reared as a child of the most bitter poverty, and as the oldest of 6 children, she had known very early the dreadful humiliations and shameful compromises that a slum child accepts as the basic order of its existence. The first time she had received payment for the use of her body, an unavoidable routine of such barters loomed at once relentlessly before her. Whatever the reasons for my drug addiction might be, she was unquestioningly convinced that these reasons had nothing whatever to do with hers. She even ignored the fact that I had been medically addicted in the course of a painful major illness, and she was quite right in dismissing this seeming extenuation, since she knew perfectly well that I must have liked the euphoric side effects that narcotics had for me, or I could have rid myself of them as easily as thousands of other accidentally addicted people had done. She looked at me with little hope and no calculation. All she expected of me was a certain detached paternal kindness which would last the duration of our stay at the hospital. You see, she was almost 25 years my junior, and as far as she was concerned, this was the greatest factor of safety between us. You must consider that in her highly codified environment, her serious involvement with so much older a man would have been absurdly offbeat and altogether inexplicable, unless the man were very rich and simply represented an obvious target for easy exploitation. To bridge such a gap of years takes an enormous somersault of the imagination, which the underworld is simply not prepared for. In that rigidly conformist gutter fraternity, this age differential only becomes tenable if it applies to an out-and-out sugar daddy. Roberta never saw me in that sort of role. She cherished and esteemed me, uncritically, because, like all prostitutes and most women, she had a desperate admiration for people who were well informed or could pass as such. It was, in its own peculiar way, an ideal relationship. I'm happy to report that it was in no way tarnished when we finally did meet in New York. I had discovered that she was working as a waitress in a dingy restaurant over in West 48th Street, and one day during lunch hour I dropped by and sat myself down at one of her tables. The poor thing was as flustered as a debutante whose orchid has just been clumsily decapitated, but by the time I was through eating, she had managed to regain some of her composure. I noticed that she had lost quite a bit of weight since leaving Lexington. I asked her about it later in the grim park in back of the 42nd Street Library, where she had come to join me. "Yes," she said, "I always lose weight when I get out of the hospital. You don't look any too good either. Are you clean now?" She meant, was I off drugs? "Yes," I said, 2 months now. And you?" "It's tough, but I'm managing," she said. "It's this job that gets me down. You see, my record keeps me from working in any of the better places, and the tips aren't really worth picking up." As I sat there looking at her, I marveled by what strange and cruel dispensation of fate this girl had to suffer a daily confrontation with disaster. She was quite pretty, and her clothes, though certainly cheap, were in very good taste and becoming. She had naturally wavy light brown hair and a clear, fair complexion that made her brown eyes so deeply luminous they seemed like dark mirrors of pure candor. "You got a job?" she asked me. "I'm doing some freelance writing," I said. "I'm fixing somebody's play, and they've given me a pretty good advance." "You can make it," she said. "You've got talent, and junk doesn't do anything for you anyway. You ought to get married again. You need somebody to look after. I'm the same way myself, I guess. I got myself a cat. I never had a cat before, and I'm telling you, a cat is really something. She's so clean, and they're not supposed to get as close to you as dogs do. But this one sits up on the window and waits for me to get home. She jumps right up on my shoulder when I'm getting her supper ready, and I tell you that animal is more company to me than a lot of people I've known." When we parted, I gave her my address. I was staying in the apartment of a friend who'd gone off to Hollywood on a movie job, and I told her to call me if she was ever at loose ends. "Maybe you'd like to go to the Museum of Art with me some Sunday afternoon," I said. "I'd like to," she said. "But generally, I'm so pooped when the weekend rolls around that I just have strength enough to wash and iron a few things for myself." "Well, anyway, keep it in mind," I said. She must have, because about 3 weeks later she phoned me. "I'm taking you up on your offer," she said. "Would you mind if we went to the other museum instead?" "Natural history?" I asked. "Yeah, I guess that's the one," she said. "I was once there with my class when I was just a kid, and they gave us some postcards that I kept for years and years." "Fine," I said. "Let's meet at the 77th Street entrance." Later, after we'd walked ourselves flat-footed and dizzy through the various museum exhibits, I took her to a very good Austrian restaurant right nearby. "It's been a lovely day," she said. "Just lovely. It must be wonderful to have lots of time to spend looking at such things and learning all about them." "You're still a very young woman, Roberta," I said. "Why don't you try to take some courses in the evening, maybe, and learn about things?" She looked at me suddenly with cold and detached appraisal. There was nothing warm in those dark eyes of hers then, and the corners of her mouth twisted into something that looked very much like a dress rehearsal for an oncoming sneer. "Yeah," she said. "I ought to study in the evening, oughtn't I? Night school. That's really going to be my big stick, ain't it?" I impulsively took her hand. "Roberta, dear," I said, "you must know I didn't mean to give you any advice. I've had plenty of it myself from people who didn't know what shook. I wish I could help you. You're such a valuable person. I know what you can do, what you've done. With some of the hopeless trash down in Lexington, I just wish somebody could do as much for you." Her face relented. She patted my hand reassuringly. "I know you mean the best for me. It's just that everything seems so hopeless. I drag everything with me everywhere I go. I'm not just fighting off each day. I have to duck my old pals that keep coming around and telling me not to waste my time trying to be square. It's as if every piece of dirt I ever handled had a life of its own and came back to nag at me. You say I did a lot of good for some of those kids in Lexington. Well, why don't I get a job in Lexington? Why couldn't I be an occupational therapist down there or in some other institution where they need that kind of help? You know why I can't. I've got a record as long as your arm, that's why. Oh hell, I guess some lives are like riddles that haven't got any answers. Mine sure is one of them." "You're not a Catholic, are you?" I asked. "No, I'm just nothing, I guess." It occurred to me, Roberta, that you could have been a great abbess in some cloister, somebody that builds churches and monasteries and finally becomes a saint. She laughed so hard she had to lift her little veil to wipe her eyes. "You are nuts, aren't you?" she said. "A saint, eh? Well, now I've really heard everything." "No, you haven't," I said. "Some of the most famous saints in the Christian calendar led lives that weren't any less sinful than yours has been. I'm serious, Roberta. I'll lend you some books about it if you don't believe me. Even Mary Magdalene, the friend of Jesus, had once been a courtesan. It is written in the Bible." She suddenly became quite serious. "I mustn't listen to you too often," she said. "It's much too high and boozy for that small brain of mine. I know all about the Magdalene. I just never saw the connection. At any rate, you've just got too rich a brew on tap for me. If I listened to you often enough, I'd lose my bearings altogether. I better go home now and do a little ironing. Besides, Emily, my cat, is probably getting hungry." "How come you called her Emily?" I said. "Because I knew a librarian by that name once. She was a little bit of a puffed-out body, and she used to recommend books to me. She was one of the few people when I was a child who was real nice to me. When she died, I went to her funeral, and I got the stuffing beat out of me by my father. Later it turned out she'd left me $50 in her will. So the old man took me to Coney Island, and he got so drunk, I spent the night in the police station. Anyway, I've got another Emily now." I met Emily 5 weeks later when the janitor of Roberta's building brought her around to my apartment. He brought her in a cardboard box and handed me a note. It said, "Dear friend, I'm off to the dry cleaners again. I don't have to tell you how I feel. You've been through it yourself often enough. I hope you can give a home to Emily. If you cannot, please drop her at the Bidewee home. Who knows? Somebody may take a shine to her. I will call you in about 5 months. Maybe. Your grateful friend, Roberta." Emily lived up to her reputation and became my darling for the next 4.5 months. Roberta took her away from me after that, and I missed that cat so much it made a real dent in my daily existence. A short while later, I once more became entangled with the dope chimera, and I had other endearing beasties. I had little room in my life to ponder the difficulties of cats or any other endearing beasties. In short, I misled Emily and Roberta, along with many other facts and fancies along my slimy and bedeviled road, and I just landed myself right smack back in Lexington again. When I emerged, after 6 months this time, one most significant change had taken place in the catastrophic routine of my days. Margie was waiting for me at the entrance gates of the institution. She said, "I've saved up quite a bit of money, enough, I think, to take us both to Thailand." "To Thailand?" I said. "What for?" "So you can go on taking dope legally," she said, "or at least without too much trouble. I can get jobs singing in the cafes in Bangkok, and maybe you can draw some quick portrait sketches of tourists in the saloons out there, and we'll earn enough to get by on and have some kind of life together, no matter what else may happen." That's what she said. Well, I didn't take her up on it. We're just managing the best we can, right here, among the local heathen. Now that I come to think of it, the most consistent and tireless funeral goer of my whole acquaintance is Marielle Kroner Ebenheim. Actually, she could call herself, and sometimes does, Marielle Kroner Mitloff Spendish Hartwig Lazar Ebenheim. The Marielle Kroner is what she started out with. The other 5 names she's married, buried, divorced, or abandoned. Her first husband, Middeloff, was a sculptor. The second, Spendish, was a composer. Hartwig was a playwright. Lazar disgorged novels, and Ebenheim preached psychiatry. The first and second she buried, the third and fourth she divorced, and the 5th she just walked out on. You don't really have to bother keeping all these not terribly vital statistics too clearly in mind, since they never were any too clear in hers either. I remember that when she talked about her past bedfellows and board providers, she very often got their names, their professions, and even their different tenures of duration so mixed up with each other that finally she just referred to them simply by numbers and ignored the date sequences of their various accessions too. And retirements from public office completely. On closer consideration, I must admit that, perhaps, her life was not one long ritual of joy and high ecstasy after all. You see, she had a rival, a most formidable rival too, and no less a person than the well-known Mrs. Mahler-Werfel Gropius, a lady who had been married successfully to the distinguished composer Gustav Mahler, the enormously popular novelist Franz Werfel, and the world-renowned architect Walter Gropius. Now then, just consider poor Marielle's bitter moments whenever she came around to tallying up the score of her own hits and misses in the marriage game, and you can understand that she had more than reasonable cause to be bitterly annoyed with the dirty, underhanded dealings of destiny. The years had not dealt too kindly with her either. She had become a waddling, terribly nearsighted bolster of a woman, wearing queer blouses, strange jewelry, and pretty alarming hats. "My husband number 2, she once said to me, was 20 times more talented than Mahler, but he absolutely ignored popularity. He simply refused to play the game of musical politics. He was a real artist, not a finagler." "You think Gustav Mahler was a finagler?" I said. I know nothing about him, she said. He may have been the most straightforward and honorable of men, but I'm sure he had friends who jumped into the breach for him. Number 2 had nobody but me, and very few loyal believers. Do you know that Dolphus's nephew came to his funeral and wept right into the open grave before everyone? He had to take off his glasses 3 times. The people were just astonished. When he shook my hand, he said, "Austria will never recover from this blow." He was right. It never did. But no matter how bravely Merelli jabbered on about her gifted ex-mates, the sad truth that somehow, in the world's eyes, they had never really made it, just soured her days. My number 4, she said, won the Eibenschwitz Prize in Liechtenstein in 1939, and even Goebbels, when he heard about it, said, "I cannot believe that such a talent can belong to a decadent Jew." What good did it do him? The war interfered with all his publishing plans, and his temper became finally so unmanageable we simply had to part, for both our sakes. I still love that man to this day. Among the 5 geniuses I was married to, he was the one who had the true Renaissance temperament. He could cook, he could sew, he was a great writer, and his petit point chair backs fetched $200 apiece at Druitt's right after the war. His next wife realized a fortune on his embroideries alone. Actually, Merelli was not too well off financially because she had speculated very badly with the little money she had managed to accumulate from her 5 unsuccessful husbands. After walking out on the psychiatrist, she became involved with a pansy interior decorator, and she invested almost all her ready cash in this creature's 3rd Avenue antique shop. Her partner, whose name was Boyce Binion, spent a good deal of her investment on a new wardrobe, since he felt this was basically essential in a business that dealt almost exclusively with nouveau riche snobs. Somehow, his velvet vests and high-button, cloth-topped shoes failed to lure the suckers into the store. Only other pansy interior decorators showed up, and the place was always a gurgle with their falsetto laughter and steaming with the odor of hot chocolate. The antique ashtrays in the joint were generally full of brownie crumbs, while the cigarette butts mostly landed up in the display windows. It was a real hang-up for poor Merelli. How could I have made such a mistake? And that Boyce person, she wailed. He seemed such a clean-cut type. I would have trusted him with my life. Did you notice that there was something queer and effeminate about him? I said. God in heaven, I'm a European woman. I'm used to men who aren't so athletic, she said. Very few men look like baseball players in Vienna, or even in Paris for that matter. How could I possibly have known such a thing? He always had gold buttons all over himself, I said, and you surely must have noticed that he painted his fingernails and dyed his hair? You sophisticated people have it easy talking, she said, but a poor simpleton like me just fell into the pit. What am I going to do now? He has spent all my money on silk underthings, and the store is just like a morgue. It is as if the plague had hit it. The dogs in the street won't even pee up against our windows, as if they felt that just to come too near to us was already bad luck. I'm going to lose my mind if something doesn't happen soon. Do you know what finally happened? She got a legal divorce from the psychiatrist and married Boyce Binion. When I asked her about it, she said, I figure as long as he spent all my money anyway, I might at least have the use of some of those elegant kimonos he bought. And what are you both going to do about money? I asked. I'm going to get rid of the stock in the store at any price, she said. And now, in my old age, I'll just have to go to work. Work at what? I said. I'm going to join the actor's studio, she said. and I'll go on the stage. Other people have done it. I'm not too proud. And that's where we left it for the time being. Yay. Okay. I shut the book. It was some chapter. I think it was chapter 11. Really shouldn't have shut the book. Okay. Have a good night. Enjoy yourself. Take care of yourself. Be well. Eat well, sleep well, drink well. Do the things well. Also, I guess I should state it because everything is easy to misunderstand. I enjoy this book. That doesn't necessarily mean I always hold the viewpoints as Bible. Someone, now that I'm at it, it's been 35 minutes. Someone left a comment on like a beginning video instead of going through the series saying, well, if you don't like the book or the person, why do you read it? And I said, because it's dangerous existing in a vacuum of information. To which they responded, and it was about Marguerite Porete, The Mirror of Simple Souls, to which they responded about the plight that Marguerite Porete went through, not the literature itself. So asking me why I dislike the literature, not watching me develop an opinion about the literature, and then going on to state that what she went through ought to spell enough reason out for me to like the literature. The art is not what she went through. One. And two, I don't need to like something in order to be able to learn from it or to take something away to grow from it. My aim is not necessarily to enjoy everything I come by or even to like everything I come by. My aim is to learn from everything I come by. And those are two drastically different things entirely. My joy is in learning. My joy is not in feeling towards what someone else says. And then to address the third comment they left. Was it the third comment or the next comment that I just didn't say what it was? It was the life she led that that she suffered an ego death and then died being burned alive. To which I gave a response that I think ought to be known generally. Don't know why I think it ought to be known, I just do. This chapter talked about drug abuse, and I'm not without my own. But having said that, I've been around a lot of groups of people that really, really honor ego death. As far as I have understood it, especially reading philosophy, ego is one's means of survival. A sense of self and the intrinsically coded identity of self that helps one continue on living. I have never personally understood, as much as I've sat down and listened to people talk about it, understood why an ego death is honored more than any lesson ever. It's the same thing. I think I started these videos by saying I do not think the experience should be honored more than the end result. What you took away from that, what you learned from that, how you came out of that, and what you did with it should be respected a hell of a lot fucking more than the fact that it happened at all. Okay, bye. Good night. Enjoy yourselves.